Hello, classmates. My name is Peter Wright, for those of you that don't know me, and I will be covering the pericope of Luke 1, 5 through 25, just a short 20 verses. I'll be going over my first paper and the research, what that bared out, and my narrative critical review of that passage. And then I will go into the second paper, which is Luke's usage of the Old Testament in his own narrative. And honestly, the second paper sort of informs the first. And I found it very interesting on how these two papers really, in a sense, were one larger paper, both informing each other as to how Luke is working. And it really reveals the masterpiece, which is just the 20 verses in which Luke is writing. So, let's begin with the first paper. Luke starts from the very beginning with the Jewish language. His description of the time period in which he places or observes his narrative is in the days of King Herod. This was Old Testament imagery from the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and different Old Testament books, in which would annotate a specific time in history, such as in the year that King Uzziah died. It was a specific time in which Isaiah was writing, and here this was a specific time in which the story of the gospel took place, and Luke was intentional in noting that. And for reasons that go beyond just the usage of Old Testament language, King Herod had taken power despite strong resistance from Jewish elders, and this, with other political and cultural problems in the day, created a very politically and religiously tense time in which Luke's narrative took place, in which the gospel took place. So why this anchor? And we'll get more into that later, but back to Luke's use of Old Testament, or specifically Septuagint language, and his description of both his characters. They're described as righteous, quotations from Deuteronomy. And they're also described as well advanced in years. And specifically to Elizabeth, a quotation from Genesis 18:11 is used in describing Elizabeth's barrenness. He takes the quote when speaking of Sarah's barrenness and lays it on top of his character, a direct quote. And so you can see that Luke is trying to parallel these stories, parallel past stories and past narratives in which God intervened, in which God worked, and he's laying them on top of his own. And so that informs really that while at face value, the fact that his characters are righteous yet barren, that would be a problem, because righteousness does not produce barrenness in some Jewish mindsets. But given that Abraham and Sarah were on the winning side of history, Luke's use of this parallel would give his audience the correct assumption that both Zacharias and Elizabeth would too be on the winning side of history. Even his description of a side character, the people which were praying outside of the temple as Zacharias offered his priestly incense, his duty of that year. He uses the word laos, which indicates the righteous covenant people of God, a people belonging to Yahweh. And when they were present, the commentators made a note that whenever they were present, it would seem that Yahweh or God would do something in the presence of his righteous covenant people when they were praying to him or crying out to him. And so Luke again couches his narrative amongst Jewish piety and Jewish prayer, amongst covenant with God. And so this would create a longing or an expectation for something to happen, given that it did in the Old Testament. This intentional drawing of Old Testament language and Old Testament imagery would give a direct connection between the past saving acts of God and Luke's present story. Furthermore than this, Luke places Zacharias, which he was just simply by observation, but the way in which he plays it out, Zacharias is in the temple, and it plays the largest role in the foundation of the rest of the narrative. The temple, it fosters a view which God is the focal point of life, and in Luke's case it gives a sacred connection for the divine to take place. It was the appropriate place, and for Luke it was a cultural defining point. And it functioned in many ways. For him, it was God's house. It was the nexus between God and humanity. It would segregate space and people as more or less holy, and it would define who has more or less access to what is holy. The temple was the locus of holiness and purity, where revelation could be given and received, and where eschatological fervor can be focused. And that's important because Luke seems to take a keen interest or a liking to the eschatological importance of what happened in this specific narrative. And so Luke describes a story in which Zacharias is offering incense in the temple, and the reader would immediately understand that there was a lack of priests, there was a lack of people within the temple. Those familiar would understand that it was such a large building, there were so many things that needed to be done, that really there had to be more than just one priest. But given that there is only Zacharias, and given that there is actually a chiasm here, which starts in verses 8 through 10, in which there's the service, the sanctuary, and the people. And then verses 11 through 12, there's the angel Gabriel's appearance. And then there's Zachariah's response. And then I guess the letter C would be the announcement of good news, verses 13 through 17 and 19. And then back to B would be Zacharias' objection and the angel's response. There's a reversal there. And then back to the beginning, which there's people, sanctuary, and service in verses 21 through 23. Excuse my cough, I've had it for a while. But this intentional zoning in which Zacharias is the only priest in the temple, and this chiasm which starts with the service, sanctuary, and people, and then comes back out, it creates this intentional zoning in and almost gives a rabbit hole, I called it in my paper, a rabbit hole kind of effect in which Zacharias falls into this strange event in which he has a vision and an angel appears and all this crazy stuff, and the scriptures describe him as afraid, and then he comes back out, but when he comes back out he's mute and he's changed and he's been given all this new information. And so the story, sorry for the delay there, my computer seems to malfunction whenever I need it to work. But as I was saying, there's this sort of into the rabbit hole effect in which Zacharias experiences. And what's going on here is that Luke is creating a mini narrative within the larger narrative that he's telling within these 20 verses. And what it is he's zoning in and he's drawing attention to what is happening. What is happening within this small narrative? This is important. This is what is going on. This is what the story is about. And what happens is that the angel Gabriel gives announcements pertaining to a child which is to be born to them named John. A lot can be said. A lot can be said about what is going on, which we do not have time to cover. But the focus is on John. The description of John indicates a Nazarene vow, Nazarite vow. But a key facet of it, the hair is missing. There's no mention of long hair that can't be cut. And so this seems unlikely. And more probable, his restrictions and regulations and different things that were said about John indicate that he used to be a priestly character, actually a melded character of many different Old Testament images, which again we don't have time to go over, but this is more likely because he used to function as a priest, calling the people and purifying them, calling them to repentance, purifying their worship, purifying them before Yahweh. And there'll be more on this and what this means and why this is important whenever I go over the second paper. But the imagery is obvious. John is to function sort of as a melded character, both priestly, but more importantly and specifically given the Malachi quotation, which will be gone over in the next video, he is to function as an Elijah figure. And he serves as an eschatological trumpet, which Malachi, the last prophetic book in the Old Testament canon, speaks of, and one of Luke's quotations, one that he describes, in which a messenger or Elijah would go before Yahweh. And so after Elijah would come, then Yahweh would follow. That's important, and we'll go over that more. But what can be said is that Luke's intentional zoning in is an intentional creating of a smaller narrative within his larger narrative of the 20-25 verses of what it is to say this story, what is going on, the significance of what he is trying to portray, and the expectancy, the eschatological expectancy which he's trying to produce in his reader, is that the story is about John, and by extension is by his description, the story is about the forerunner of Yahweh. And Luke is masterful at drawing the reader to keep reading, to keep turning the pages, to figure out what he's talking about. And more will be said about this in the next paper, in the next video. I'm sorry. Thank you. Welcome back, classmates. Our time is short, and so I will try to move quickly as to not extend this video longer than it needs to be. As has been stated about the first paper and the first videos that were recorded, this passage is full of Old Testament references, allusions, shadows, imagery, echoes, all sorts of things. But they all, for me, and according to my research and other scholars, they are pointing to one central thing that Luke is trying to get across, and that is really in his use of Malachi 4, chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, and even as far back as 4 through 6, which is quoted in Luke 1, 16 and 17, in which John is described as one who's going to turn the hearts of the children of their fathers, fathers of the children, is the actual Malachi reference, and that he's going to go in the spirit and power of Elijah before the Lord. And like it has been said in the first video, it is clear that John is to function as Elijah figure. That is clear. That is simple. That's how Luke is portraying John. And within the Old Testament context itself, Malachi closes out with both the law and the prophets. And at least in the Masoretic text, its focus is on the final verse, which is to be ready or to be prepared for the coming of the Lord, or Yahweh's return. And one of the final words there is ban, I believe, and it indicates a curse or a detriment to the land if the land were not to be prepared. And the day of the Lord, this theme of Yahweh's returning, that great and terrible day which the Old Testament describes, is a theme throughout the Old Testament. And it's found in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Zephaniah, Malachi, all these different Old Testament prophetic books, and even some non-prophetic books. This theme of the day of the Lord and this expectancy is found all throughout them. And for the Jewish people, they were coming into Luke's time period in which he tells his story. They were in exile. They were exiled, and they were without a temple and all this stuff before the temple was being rebuilt. But there was a sense that Yahweh had left. Long story short, there's a sense that Yahweh had left, and that one day he would return. But Malachi prophesies that before he would return, he would send a messenger before his face. This is found in Isaiah. The Malachi reference is the one that we're talking about. He would send somebody before him, and that somebody would be Elijah. He would send Elijah before his return. Before Yahweh's return, Elijah would return and come and prepare the people and call them back to covenant relationship. And that's where the important part of Elijah's turning of the hearts is a turning of the people back to the covenant relationship. And to describe John in such a way, to give him these pointers and these indicators of Elijah imagery to someone of Jewish culture, to someone familiar with Old Testament references, Old Testament imagery, Old Testament narrative, this would have been a huge play on their expectancy. And Luke does a masterful job through the beginning, the opening of his narrative, all the way through the end of it, through Gabriel's announcements and his description of who John would be and what he was supposed to be. Luke is masterfully playing on the Jewish culture of expectancy, of this day of the Lord which was coming. Luke is masterful about it, and there's no doubt in any of the scholars' mind that Luke is doing this. Luke is saying, this story we're familiar with of Elijah coming. Well, John, the one who's to be born to these pious Jewish characters who mirror that of Abraham and Sarah, who they were promised through their seed the whole world would be blessed, and out of their barrenness came a child, and out of their barrenness came generations of people who would serve God. And yes, there are up and downs, but that same parallel is happening now. That person that was supposed to come, Elijah is coming. And so for anybody familiar with that, they would have assumed and they would have known that Yahweh was soon to follow, and Luke is playing on that. But it is interesting that chronologically read, if Elijah is coming, then Yahweh was to follow. That is, the old people who are familiar with the Old Testament. If Luke is saying, Elijah's coming, Elijah's here, their thought pattern and thought process, they say, well, Yahweh's right behind him. Yahweh's coming right behind. But the next thing that Luke does is interesting. He introduces Jesus. So after playing it up so powerfully with Old Testament imagery and Jewish culture expectancy, which even modern day Jews have Elijah mixed into a lot of their rituals and a lot of their religious rites that young people go through. They place a cup for Elijah. They pray, Lord, send your messenger Elijah, because they know if Elijah comes, Yahweh comes. So he plays this up so powerfully, and then he introduces Jesus. And of course that is another topic for another time. But And in Luke's use of the Old Testament, specifically the Malachi reference, what he is doing is playing on that long-standing tradition of eschatological expectancy of Yahweh's return through the return, or that is supposed to come after the return of Elijah. Luke is playing on that through his use of the Old Testament language, an Old Testament quotation of Malachi 4:4-6, or 5-6 more specifically. That is the end of my second paper, and again, it informs the first so much, in that he paints it as politically and religious time. Then he parallels stories of the Old Testament in which God was on that side, God was on that winning side, and then he describes John as an Elijah figure, which was to turn the hearts back to covenant relationship. And really, what it is that there's a balancing of power going on here. This expectancy of Yahweh to return and make things right. That was there, and Luke knew it, and Luke was playing on it. And he observed this masterful piece of art that God had orchestrated, and he is now writing about, and now he is trying to tell his audience what is going on. Concluding reflections are soon to follow. I am aware that I am already at the 15-minute mark, so I will simply read some things that I've written down for my closing reflections. Luke is a master of his craft and does not lie when he says he has perfect understanding. The knowledge and skill Luke uses to create his gospel undoubtedly shines through his entire work. Simply in his opening, the opening narrative of tapestry is woven before the reader's eyes that calls them to look close at what is truly going on. As Luke spins his tale, the audience draws nearer and observes the mesmerizing schema in which Luke works. The masterful interweaving of both Old and New Testament, followed by keen observation of the realities of God's promises coming to pass right before Luke's eyes, calls once again to the reader to understand the truth of Luke's story. It is more than fiction. It is more than a good narrative, or an ancient biography at that. It is another chapter in God's book in which Luke is all too aware of as he writes with understanding of the connections between the Old and New Testaments. He, while some scholars argue, is much more subtle than other gospel writers when connecting the Old Testament to the New, declares the truth of God's breaking into the present realities of his time. Luke records that God had made promises through his prophets of the day in which he would return. And just as Luke's opening character's name declares, Zacharias, that is, God remembers. God was in fact, Luke announces, coming.